Hi everybody, this is a quick review of poetry since we are in our last week of poetry and next week we begin drama. So, things I want you to remember about poetry, they always feature subjects and topics. Poems often have more than one theme, and simply locating a theme or themes cannot do justice to or fully explain the experience of reading a poem. Tone involves the way a poem uses language to convey an attitude toward its subjects and theme. Diction, or the poet's word choice, determines not only meaning, but just about every effect a poem produces. Denotation is a word's unambiguous dictionary meaning, while connotations are a word's emotional implications and the associations it evokes. Precision of denotation may be just as impressive and productive of special effects as the resonance or ambiguous suggestiveness of connotation. Syntax is the way the sentences are put together. So you can see by the slide that topics of poems are sometimes clear based on their categories, for example, love poems, and sometimes they're not so clear. Keep in mind that poems on the same subject can be very different in attitude or approach to that topic. The speaker of a poem is the voice offering the poem's words to the reader. That voice may be the poet's, or it may be that of a created character who expresses ideas or feelings very different from the poet's own. Never assume a poem speaker is always the poet. Some of the poems were supposed to dislike or distrust the speaker, rather than take his or her words at face value. It's not a poem, it's a short story, post Casco Amontillado. Montresor, the narrator there, the speaker of that story, really isn't trustworthy. A dramatic monologue is a poem spoken entirely by one fictional speaker in a specific time, place, and situation. Sometimes identifying the poem's setting is important to understanding the speaker, as when a speaker reflects on events that are long past. The setting is the time and place in which a poem is situated. Sometimes the setting of a poem is vague or unspecified. The situation of a poem takes into account the kinds of events or actions represented, the location of these occurrences in time and place, the identity of the speaker and of other figures represented or implied, and the reasons for these occurrences. For a bit more of a refresher, check out last week's video lecture for more information on setting and situation of poetry. An allusion is a reference to something outside the poem that carries a history of meaning and strong emotional associations. A poem written about a specific occasion is called an occasional poem. Kind of obvious, right? And such a poem is referential. In other words, it refers to a certain historical time or event. So some poems do indeed invoke specific historical events or situations, but to understand and respond to these types of poems, the reader must be acquainted with their historical contexts. Or the reader may become really intrigued and interested about this historical context, do a little bit of research to learn more about those historical contexts, and then reread the poem and understand or get a deeper understanding of what the poem is talking about. Regarding sensory elements, there are concrete and abstractions. So instead of depending on abstract ideas, language of poetry is most often concrete in its visuals and pictorials. In other words, poetry frequently paints pictures with words. Words aren't simply sounds. Words represent or signify things, actions, and feelings. Poets provide verbal representations to get across what they've seen or imagined to readers. So in that way, words are symbolic and heavily significant. Description can be narrowing terms by category, expanding through detail, or comparing two things or ideas. So description occurs multiple ways. Regarding figurative speech and language, a figure of speech pictures something in terms of something else familiar to us, asking us to think of the one thing as if it were the other. Poets frequently rely on figures of speech or figurative language to clarify and make their ideas precise, as well as to suggest a range of feeling. So that's why they use figures of speech, and not only poets, but any kind of writer, to spice up or to make a piece of text more interesting. Writers employ figures of speech and figurative language. Regarding metaphor and simile, in a metaphor, something is implicitly compared to something else or represented as if it is that thing. When metaphors extend over long sections of a poem, they are called extended metaphor. Similarly, a controlling metaphor extends over an entire poem. And in a simile, one thing is directly compared to something else. usually with the word like or as. Similes actually make quick comparisons that are not elaborated. So when a simile develops a very elaborate comparison and extends through long sections of a poem, it's called an analogy. A symbol, defined at the most basic level, is something that stands for something else. Symbols in poetry are words and phrases that have a range of references beyond their literal signification or denotation. Personification involves treating an abstraction, such as death or justice or beauty, or an inanimate object, as if it were a person. Poets choose words for their sounds as well as for their meanings, using sound effects to create a mood or establish a tone. Sometimes the sounds in poems provide special effects, but often sound is intertwined with meaning. To get the full effect of a poem, it is important to read that poem aloud and attend to its vocal rhythms and sounds. That's why in last week's lecture I read aloud that Shakespearean sonnet, so you can hear it and you can get an ear full of the rhythms, the vocal rhythms, and the sounds that Shakespeare employs. When a word captures or approximates the sound of what it describes, such as splash or squish, that word is called onomatopoeia. Poets can use pacing, rhythm, and pauses, as well as sounds to imitate the subject being described. Meter is the basic rhythmic pattern of stressed and unstressed syllables in a poem. So here's an example. Meter or metrical foot is a unit of measure of poetry. And here's an example of the most common metrical pattern, iambic. And I mentioned in last week's lecture that Shakespeare's sonnets are in iambic pentameter. And so this is what an example, if you were to scan, we didn't cover that and we're not going to cover it, so I'm just introducing it. If you're going to perform scansion or scan a poem, you start identifying the meters, the rhythm, the metrical foot, and the metrical pattern to see what type it is. So you can see with this, these are blocked off. This is one metrical foot, that time of year, thou mayest in me behold. So basically, with Shakespearean or English sonnets, a metrical foot is 2 syllables, that time of year. Now, these little signs right here, the U and the line, that indicates whether it is an unstressed or stressed syllable. The U is an unstressed, so not enough emphasis or very light emphasis is put on that. That time of year thou mayest in me behold. That time, notice how time is stressed, that time of year, year is stressed. So it's almost as if the first syllable in an iambic pentameter rhythm poem is swallowed, and then the second syllable is emphasized. Now with this right here, mayest, the way Shakespeare wrote it, we should say it as one syllable, thou mayest. When we kind of want to draw it into 2 syllables, mayest, but it's not, it's one syllable, mayest. So this is iambic pentameter, this is the most common metrical pattern, and this is what you find in Shakespearean sonnets. So a foot is a unit of measure of poetry. Meters determined by the kind of foot or the regular pattern of accents and a number of syllables per line. And that's what these are, the accents, unstressed, stressed. The U shape is unstressed, the line right there is stressed. Line lengths are usually described in terms of the number of feet. Pentameter uses 5 feet per line. Octometer uses 8, tetrameter uses 4, etc. So if you were to count, remember, these 2 syllables equals 1 metrical foot. If you were to count these, the metrical feet, you would have 5, and thus the name pentameter. That time is 1 meter, or 1 foot, I should say. Of year is the 2nd foot. Thou mayest is the 3rd foot. In me is the 4th foot, and behold is the 5th foot. Pentameter. In English, the most common metrical pattern is iambic, in which each foot contains an unstressed syllable followed by a stressed syllable. Iambic pentameter, one of the most common meters used in poetry written in English, consists of lines containing 5 iambic feet. And as I mentioned just a while ago and in last week's video lecture, Shakespearean sonnets are in iambic pentameter. There are other types of meters, and I'm just introducing them to you. If you're going to become an English major, then you will learn these very closely. But there are other types of meters. So the first one is trochee. A trochee is a stressed syllable followed by an unstressed syllable syllable. An anapest is made up of 2 unstressed syllables followed by a stressed syllable. A dactyl is a stressed syllable followed by 2 unstressed syllables. A spondee is a pair of unstressed syllables. A caesura is a short pause within a line, often, though not always, signaled by a mark of punctuation such as a comma. If you want to learn more, definitely go to your textbook. It's described more in detail in your textbook. Keep in mind that poets may adhere to traditional metrical forms or experiments with new patterns. Poetry that has no governing pattern of stresses or line lengths is called free verse. Rhyme scheme is a pattern of rhymes in a poem, usually at the end of the lines. Rhymes are indicated by using a different letter of the alphabet to represent each distinct rhyme sound. For example, A, B, C, D, which is what I did in last week's video lecture when I showed you the rhyme scheme of the Shakespearean sonnet. Old English poetry, such as the epic poem Beowulf, used alliteration, and alliteration is the repetition of sounds instead of rhyme. Rhyme can serve as a mnemonic or memory device because its pattern is often helpful when people try to memorize poetry. This quality would have been especially important in earlier ages when poetry was more oral art and was not always written down. Blank verse is poetry that does not rhyme but that adheres to strict metrical requirements. Consonance is the repetition of initial consonant sounds through its sequence of words. Assonance is the repetition of vowel sounds through a sequence of words. And there are different types of poetry structures. So here we have a lyric poem, which is a short poem in which the speaker expresses personal emotion. Lyric poetry is often harmonious or romantic. A poem has a narrative structure if it tells a story, that is, if its organization involves the passing of time as well as action moving forward, much like a story. A poem has a dramatic structure when it consists of a series of scenes presented vividly as if on stage. A poem has a discursive structure if it's organized like a treatise, an argument, or an essay. And a poem may have one or more shifts in tone, subject, or structure. So that's the beauty and sometimes frustrating part of poetry. Visual formatting. Technopagnia is the construction of poems with visual appeal. And here we have a picture of technopagnia poetry. So this can be a balloon or a lollipop to the left, and it is a poem structured and constructed with words. Poems composed in a specific shape to resemble physical objects are called concrete poems or shaped verse, which is what these are. Here, the poem with the girl's face, the wind in my hair feels so fresh and cool and free, etc. Those lines form her hair. And this poem is formed, the flag part of the poem is formed with words. So poetry can be intense, it can be complex, it can be fun, it can be playful, it can be painful. That's what I was going to say earlier. And there are different types of poetry. Unless if you're going to be an English major, you really don't need to know every single specific type of poetry. However, be aware, and as you're reading more and you begin working on your poetry analysis, your short poetry analysis, be aware of what type of poem you're analyzing. And if you want to challenge yourself, do a little bit of scansion. Turn to the textbook and look for scansion and identify its meter and its rhythm. That's it for now. Talk to you later. Bye.